name is Alake. I'm the CEO of the Africa Center. The Africa Center was established in 1964, so this is actually our 60th anniversary. And it was set up, first of all, as a place for Africans to connect, as a place for them to meet each other, for them to be educated about each other, and to educate other people about Africa as well. And there's also a place for advocacy, where Africans could advocate for and on behalf of themselves and for issues that impact on Africa. So you can imagine back in 1964, about two-thirds of Africa was still under colonial rule. It was quite a hostile environment still for Black people back then. So they needed a space where they could freely talk, where they could freely have conversations and robust debates and generate new ideas about how they were going to, one, gain their independence if they hadn't, or what they were going to do with their independence for those who had got it, and more importantly, how we were going to work together as Africans in forging this new continent, this newly free, independent continent, to ensure the benefit of all Africans and not just individual nations. And that's what the organization has been doing ever since. It's been a place for education, for connection, and for advocacy. And though the contexts have changed over the years, that mission has still remained very steadfast and is as relevant today as it's ever been.
Wow, what an amazing summary. Thank you so much. Yeah, it is quite sobering to hear that the Africa Centre, was established at a time where Africa was still going, undergoing or coming out of colonial powers. And, I'm from Ghana, and Ghana was the first African or sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, which is something I'm incredibly proud of. But then I do think, it's just a shame that it just took so many like African countries a long time. It's awful, and I think the colonial history it's still there. But I think institutions like yours kind of help us get out of that and help us establish our own, identity and our own cultural heritage. So thank you so much, Olu, for that introduction. Can you share some milestones or achievements that the African Centre is particularly proud of in its 60-year history?
Gosh, where do you start? I guess the first one is actually quite prosaic, but quite relevant given the times that we're in. And that is that it's still here. Survival is actually the Africa Center's biggest achievement so far. And I know that might seem a bit undercooked as an answer, but it's actually very, very important because
Yeah.
there are not too many Black-led organizations that have got a 60-year history, that have still been around from 1964 as the Africa Center has been. And there's a reason why we've survived. One, it's because we have generally been well run, but more importantly, because we've been well supported, by the very community that it is set up for and has managed to directly or indirectly, ensure that there are infrastructures in place to ensure its survival and its relevance till today. Second big achievement is how the Africa Center has been able to maintain that sense of being a home away from home for Africans. It's really, really important for African people to have somewhere that is theirs, to, have a place and a physical space, that they can claim as their own, where they know that from the moment they come in, they're stepping into Africa. Once they step into the front doors, they're stepping into Africa. You're stepping into acceptance. You're stepping into a place that cares for you and cares about you and cares about people who look like you. It can shield you from the outside world for the duration that you are in there. It can be a place where you can connect with people, share your aspirations and your identity. Is a place where you can reaffirm and reassert your sense of self as an African. And nothing gives me more pleasure as the chief exec of the organization now than people coming in and saying, I feel at home. I feel comfortable. I
Yeah.
feel happy being here. That's really, really powerful. And then, thirdly, I would say the opportunity and hope, that people find within the Africa Center is a significant achievement as
Yeah.
well. The stories that you hear, this has been our 60th anniversary, going through the archives and actually meeting the living archives. That's the people,
Yeah.
who have had a history at the Africa Center, who have set up, who have met people that who learned something that has stayed with them forever, from
Mhm.
being at the Africa Center, who have set up businesses or organizations
Mm.
that are continuing till today at the Africa Center, governments that have been able to find a place and home for their citizens at the Africa Center. That's the kind of thing that we really, really, that the Africa Center is rightly, and should always be quite proud about. So there's some stories. I mean, I'll give you a couple of very recent stories, that I
Mhm.
demonstrates this. So we had to celebrate Wale Shaker's 90th birthday, we had a festival, a program of
Mhm.
activity in his honor in July, just a couple of months ago. So we had 9 days of activity and 43 events over those 9 days. And the great man himself came over one of those days as well. One of my friends came over from Nigeria specifically for that program.
Mhm.
And it was while he was here that he said the Africa Center actually has a very, very special place in his heart. And I asked him why. And he said he was awarded a scholarship to study at university in Scotland in the
Mhm.
80s. And when he got to London, they hadn't actually sent him the money. They sent him a ticket, but they
Mhm.
hadn't actually sent him any money. So he got to London and
Mhm.
was stranded and couldn't even didn't know how he was going to get to Aberdeen, where
Yeah.
the university was. He was totally underdressed. He came in January. He was totally
Mhm.
underdressed for the weather, and he didn't know where to go. And he just wandered into the Africa Center and told them his plight. And there and then they wrote a check for him of £400, which in 1989 was a lot of money, and
Yes.
he used that to buy himself clothes, buy himself a ticket to get to Aberdeen. And that was how he was able to resume his master's program. And that's the kind of thing that the Africa Center, has done for many people, many of which we'll probably never even know about. But the more we share these kind of stories, the more we will hear. Also, as well, the Africa Center was a place where many, back in the 70s, 60s, certainly into the 80s, there weren't too many places where African creatives could
Yeah.
exhibit their art or exercise their craft. And the Africa
Mhm.
Center was always a home for them, to do those kind of things. And a lot of artists, contemporary artists, had their very first exhibitions at the Africa Center.
Mhm.
Two of those artists have gone on to win Turner Prizes. And just think about how many more people through the years we have lost because they have not realized there's an Africa Center,
Mhm.
so the talent that we have lost, but more importantly, the talent we have gained, from having the Africa Center around. So those are the kind of things that we're really proud about when we talk about opportunity, hope, and being home away from home.
Thank you. That was so profound. And I think it is challenging to try and summarize 60 years of achievements, but I think you've done that so beautifully. And especially that story, of that gentleman walking in and not having any money and the institution giving him money so he can carry on with his travels is something that will definitely stick with you and a reminder of why, organizations like yours are just so important to Africans in the diaspora. So thank you. That was really, really profound there. So Africa has one of the fastest growing youth populations in the world. How does the Africa Centre support initiatives that empowers Africa's youth both on the continent and in the diaspora?
Young people are the future. Young Africa is the future of the world. So it's not just about young people being the future of the Africa Center. And in recognition of that, the Africa Center places young people very much at the heart of its programming. For instance, when we're looking back at celebrating our 60th anniversary, the question is, yeah, we survived 60 years. So what's the next 60 years going to be like? And who is the
Yes.
next 60 years actually for? And it's not for me. I'm lucky to be around in 60 years time, but it's for it's for the younger generations, our children, our younger brothers and sisters, and our grandchildren, and ensuring that we have that legacy to pass on to them. In recognition of that, we very much place young people at the heart of what we're doing. We have established a Young Africa Center for 18 to 30. I think they've shifted to 18 to 35-year-olds now. I think that's because a couple of them are getting close to 30, so they want to stay involved. But we've got a Young Africa Center, which is a forum for young people to be able to craft their own sense of identity as Africans and to express that in any way that they wish to. So they have their own program of activity, as well as integrating very much into the fabric of the Africa Center's programming. They focus on things that matter to them, that matter to young people. And their program over the last year has included book launches. It's included a series of legacy talks, focus on African spirituality and philosophy. It's included talks on AI and the representation of Black femalehood within AI. So there's been a lot of really profound
Yeah.
programming on their part. But also as well is within the governance of the organization, ensuring that representation and power
Yes.
transfer is very much there. So we've got younger representation on the board of the organization. And then through our corporate partnerships as well, we stress the importance, of them supporting young people's activities and events when we talk to them about partnerships. So that includes everything from helping with career development to investing in young entrepreneurs and innovators. And that is both here in the UK and across the continent as well. We're working to the strategic theme of the global African for the next 4 or 5 years. And what that does is recognize implicitly that the future is African. There is Africa in the world, and there is the world in Africa. And we need to ensure that we are placing Africa and Africans in the most optimal position to be able to extract the fullness of their potential in forging that Africa of the future, so that we're not just a continent and a people who things are extracted from, but a people who actually add value first and foremost to ourselves and to the continent and to the African diaspora at large, as well as the world. Recognizing African excellence, to ensure that we are able to do that, we've set up a network of global affiliate organizations. And over the last year, we've had 17 organizations in countries across Africa sign up, as well as in the Americas. And what they do is they are like our eyes and ears on the ground on the continent. They can tell us what's hot and what's not. They can tell us what's coming. They can tell us how we can work with them. We can be their representative in the global north, because it's really powerful to have Africa and the global north. And those organizations are all working with younger people, either in arts, culture, innovation, entrepreneurship, creativity, various ways. So that's how we're working with young people, and that's how we are ensuring that we're placing young people at the heart of everything that we do.
Fantastic. What role has the African Centre played in the African and Caribbean communities in the UK?
Yeah, that's a very interesting one. And again, a story
I love stories.
to demonstrate that. So in the 70s, 60s, 70s, even as recently, I would say as 10 years ago, it was very difficult to be African and to assert an African identity in the UK. It was really challenging. You would speak to young people and, they would tell you they were something else, anything other than being African, because it wasn't cool to be to be African. They didn't feel that sense of, affirmation of their identity
Yeah.
in wider society. So the Africa Center was one of the few places, and I think I would say it was at the heart. It was like a nucleus for developing and forging that new sense of Black British identity that manifested itself in various ways. The Africa Center was a home away from home, not just for people from the continent, but for Black people within
Yes.
the UK as well.
Hmm.
And it became a crucible where they could then express themselves. They could explore their identity. Who actually am I as a Black person? Where did I come
Yeah.
from? Where can I get information on that? So, attending the Black history classes at the Africa Center, helps to forge that new sense of identity, recognizing that actually there isn't that much different to me as a Black British person whose parents are Jamaican or
Hmm.
Guyanese as my brother who is Ghanaian or, from
Yeah,
Nigeria. And actually, we might
exactly.
be cousins because we might have, before that separation, interruption in our history with the Atlantic slavery, we were probably the same family,
Yeah.
and that sense of identity was really forged at the Africa Center and found expression in things like Soul to Soul, who had a permanent residency at the Africa Center from
Hmm.
1985 till about 1991. And so that's really where Soul to Soul was forged, at the Africa Center, and that's why it was so popular. That's why when Soul to Soul's second album was actually titled The Africa Center, and this year was the 35th anniversary of probably one of the most important albums by a Black British group, Club Classics Volume 2 by Soul to Soul. And speaking about it, Jazzy B said was very, very clear about the importance of the Africa Center in enabling that whole culture to emerge. So it's really, really important recognition of how the Africa Center made being African cool before it became cool. Now you can't walk down the roads without, bumping into a Bangladeshi taxi driver singing along to Ashake or a South Korean restaurants, playing a Rasta. You can go to a cafe in Melbourne and they're playing Amapiano. You think, wow, that wouldn't have
Yeah.
happened 10, 15 years ago. You
Yeah.
can be more comfortable in your identity, what you wear, where you wear it. There's far more comfort in all that now than there has ever been. And having something like the Africa Center has really played a massive role in that for Black British people. We'll stress the Black history element as well because Africa Center was at the heart of establishing the Black supplementary school system in the 70s and 80s. So it was the de facto headquarters, for the Black supplementary school movement. That's where they used to meet and strategize. And those schools were then all over the country.
Mm.
It was the place from which the first white paper on Black history in the British education curriculum was written by
Hmm.
Professor Gus John, and that was back in the late 60s, early 70s. Had a really, really important role to play in that sense in, take all the things we take for granted today, or some of the
Yeah.
arguments and conversations we're still having today, you know, can trace their origins back to the Africa Center at some stage. Really are standing on the shoulders of giants, when we're in this place, and I'm very, very conscious about that.
So many things she said, stuck with me, particularly, how the African identity has definitely transitioned in the UK. Like I remember like being in school compared to what it means to be African now. And it's almost on a 180, hasn't it? Like you said, you go into like any restaurant, you might hear Afrobeats, you might hear Amapiano. It's becoming global. And I remember I was watching an Anthony Bourdain documentary, and he's like a journalist, that explores different cultures. And he went to Ghana, and he really emphasized that like so much music that you hear, from jazz to R&B, to blues to rock, it all started on this continent. And he's absolutely right. And you can hear that, as you
Mm.
hear these rising African stars, like it's in our rhythm. So really well said. My fourth question may be linked to what you've said, but is there any particular emerging African artists or African diaspora artists that the African Centre is supporting or really excited about? And what makes their work significant?
That's a difficult question, mainly because there's so many artists that we're supporting,
Yeah.
and that's just by providing space for them. One thing that I will say, though, is how we define emerging artists.
Hmm.
Because when we think the mainstream definition of emerging artists is
Hmm.
effectively the next hot young thing, right?
Yeah.
Who's
Yeah.
coming up, who's coming out. We have challenged that for ourselves, and we have redefined emerging artists to be any African artist who is emerging into the mainstream, regardless of what stage of their career they are at. And that
I
was
see.
really, really brought home to me earlier in the year when I recognized how many fantastic artists there are who came over to the UK in the 90s or 80s or even the 70s, who were not keyed into the narrow and prejudicially
Yeah.
guarded mainstream spaces and didn't have access to it, and so whose careers never blossomed, into the
Mm.
mainstream, and but still continue to do fantastic work. So championing those voices still is as important, to me and to the Africa Centre as championing the next, hot young thing. So earlier this year, in recognition of that, we platformed a South African artist. He's in his 70s now, Sabella
Hmm.
Malangu, does the most amazing, beautiful, intricate art using a very specialized method in his work. And he's been in the country for over 30 years and has never broken through to the mainstream. And we discovered him in just doing his art in a library in Stratford. And we gave him a platform here at the Africa Centre. He had an exhibition here for a few weeks. And as a result of that, he's now been invited to exhibit in galleries in South Africa, mainland
Amazing.
Europe, and so on. So
Wow.
that's an emerging artist. And it's great to follow up someone like that exhibition, someone like him,
Yeah.
with someone like Rewa, who we had in just last month, who is a young artist making absolutely fantastic work. Same thing in music, we're absolutely honored at the number of African artists who had their very first performance at the Africa Centre, and they're all household names, so you go back to the 70s and and the 80s, the Miriam Makebas, the Hugh Masekelas, the Bundu Boys, they all had their first performances in the UK at the Africa Centre. Angelique Kidjo came to the centre last year. Her first performance outside of Benin was at the Africa Centre in 1990. So it's
Yeah.
recognizing those great ones of the future, those future icons of the Africa Centre, and giving them a platform is very, very important for us in everything that we do across, arts, across culture, and across entrepreneurs and innovation as well.
Really well said, and I do appreciate you, addressing how we define an emerging artist, and also how the African Centre has helped so much artists, get to their next step in their career in a very competitive market, really. But I think the African sound is something that we all welcome and embrace. So thanks for that, Olu. What role does the African Centre play in shaping policies that affect the African communities in the UK, especially in terms of equality, representation, and inclusion?
We work largely in partnership. So our role at the Africa Centre is more facilitative than it is, directly engaging. So we provide a platform, we provide a place, we provide a space, and we utilize our assets, our goodwill, our credibility, in partnership with other organizations to identify issues and to put those issues onto the table. So earlier this year, for instance, we partnered with Operation Black Vote and the Black Equity
Oh, yeah.
Organization in developing the Black British mandate for the elections in particular, but for politics in general, what things matter to the Black British population and how we're going to put that on the table. We can do that for local issues. We can do that for national issues, and we
Mhm.
can do that for global issues as well through our partnerships. So we are a member, we're in partnership with Africa Soft Power, for instance, so we can talk about how Africans can utilize soft power more effectively, to get done what needs to be done at national, local, individual levels. We're partners with organizations like Africa No Filter, so we can, challenge narratives about Africa and African people. We are in partnership through our programs like Shakula, with local Black LGBTQI communities, so we can address their own issues and needs and ensure that they find acceptance and assertion of themselves and actualize themselves in whatever way that they deem fit. And in doing that, where there are opportunities, to speak truth to power, that's what the Africa Center has always been. We have had that radical underpinning to our existence
Yeah.
since 1964. The Africa Center was
Mhm.
the de facto headquarters for the anti-apartheid movement in the 70s and 80s. It was a place where all the dissidents from South Africa, found those in exile, found home. If
Yeah.
you step into a time machine and go back to the late 70s or early 80s and be in the Africa Center in Covent Garden, you'll be wandering around and meeting people like Thabo Mbeki at the bar and sitting down with Desmond Tutu and so on. You sit down in a corner and writers like Ngugi wa Thiong'o or Wole Soyinka would be there, with you. You would go onto the stage and you will see playwrights and writers and poets and so on at the center. And in doing that, if there are issues, if there are conversations that need to be had with governments, we can do that. With nations, the African nations, we can do that. In the last year, we've had, I think, 17 our African embassies or high commissions have had events or meetings here at the Africa Center. During the last African Cup of Nations, we screened every single one of the matches here at the center.
So
And
cool.
people from every single one of the 24 participating nations came to the center to watch a match.
That's so
And
cool.
a key part of what we then did was work in partnership again with a few other organizations like AKD Solutions and Best of Africa, was we convened a symposium during AFCON on African football and how we could work together to ensure the development of African football, African footballers in the UK and African football in Africa. And it was a really fascinating and powerful roundtable that we had, consisting of um, ex-players, consisting of agents, football lawyers, the Professional Football Association, all around the table, cultural change makers, and so on, all around journalists. We're all around the table discussing these issues. And very powerfully, something that came out was the realization when we're talking about why so many African footballers, young African footballers, don't play for African countries. What
Yeah.
no one actually realized was that there are contractual disincentives
Wow.
at younger levels. So you get a certain
Okay.
bonus if you opt to play for England, and you don't get that bonus if you opt to play for any other country. So at under 15 level, under 16 level, you get
Wow.
a certain bonus, which you don't get if you opt to play for any other countries. And you only get the equivalent level of that bonus if you opt to play for an African country as a full professional if your country gets to the final of a major tournament, which means how
Really?
many people are going to get that, And
Yeah,
even the
exactly.
Professional Football Association weren't aware of that till that meeting. It was an agent who actually revealed that, and they made the commitment there, and then that was going to stop right there and then. So that's a perfect example of
Mm,
how, just
yeah.
by having that facilitating and convening role, you can ensure difficult conversations are put onto the table and changes then made.
Very sobering. I didn't realize that. Awesome. Thanks for sharing that fact. I think a policy influence can come in a variety of ways, even stuff, ways that you may not even realize, Olu. And I think the things that the Africa Centre do has definitely inspired people 1,000%. I mean, of course, there's obvious ways like through partnership, but there also is subtle ways that I have no doubt that the Africa Centre has contributed towards, equity, inclusion, and change, especially during our 60-year history. Africa is deeply impacted by climate change. How does the Africa Centre incorporate discussions or programs related to environmental sustainability?
Launching our new exhibition, which is on climate change. It's the third such exhibition that we've had over the last year.
Wow.
We're working with young people, young creatives in particular. We have showcased not just their talents, but also the issue
Yeah.
of how climate change is impacting on us, whether we realize it or not, on a micro level and on a macro level. The difference that we can also make on an individual level and contribute to being part of the solution all the way through. And that manifests itself, across all our 5 pillars of activity in arts and culture. We can communicate, highlight to people exactly how this is impacting on us. The whole questions of migration. One of the things that is not included in the mainstream conversations about migration
Mhm.
is the impact of climate change. And
Exactly.
how this is just the beginning, in fact, it's just the tip of the iceberg, literally, on the issue of migration, because there are going to be a lot more climate change refugees in the coming years. And
Yeah,
Africa, despite being the least polluting
exactly.
continent rather, in
Yeah,
the world,
yeah,
is most disproportionately impacted by
exactly.
climate change. We can
Yeah,
see it already in desertification, but also in coastland erosion and so on,
yeah,
in the changing weather patterns and how that's impacting on food
exactly.
security and so on. It's not to be unexpected that people will flee from places of unsafety or places of insecurity that have emanated from a climate crisis that they didn't actually directly contribute to themselves, and
Exactly.
move to those countries that actually were largely responsible for that climate mess. So even being able to showcase and highlight those kind of, that kind of trajectory in the conversation is actually quite important, and
Absolutely.
raising awareness amongst all of us, especially young people, and being
Yeah.
solutions oriented about it as well. That, this is how it's impacting on you. This is what you can do about it. And this is, how we can work together to make that happen.
Precisely. Yeah, really powerfully said. You pointed out so many facts. And yeah, it's incredibly heartbreaking that despite Africa being the continent that contributes the least to global emissions, yet we are, Africa is the most impacted. My colleague Jennifer, who's the environmental strategy intern, has released, a brilliant report on addressing, the link between racial disparities and climate justice. And I guess we can't really have, racial justice without climate justice. They're very much intertwined. And I always say, climate change is the number one issue in this world. If we don't have a safe earth to live in, how can we fight for any causes that we deeply care about? Also, what is this?
Yeah. So I just wanted to show you this piece, which was created by a Nigerian artist called Gerald Chukwuma, who was on exhibition here at the center last year and donated this piece to us
Wow.
to highlight environmental awareness and climate change. Every single part of this was made from material he picked up off a beach in Lagos.
Wow.
Bits of Pepsi can, a 7-Up
Wow.
can, that's a
That's
Martina
really, really
can somewhere
beautiful.
there. This is all driftwood and bits of plastic that he picked up off the beach, so
Stunning.
he's using that to showcase, how, what something that we can all do.
Thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing that with me, and I'll
Yes.
definitely be there.